Hello, and welcome to week 4 of plant biology here at NICC. This week our reading is going to be a little different than what we've had in the past few weeks. We're moving over to a different online textbook, so it's still in the same OpenStax website, but the book is Biology 2E rather than Concepts of Biology. So the Biology 2E textbook has a little more technical information, but since we're moving into plant biology specifically, rather than the more general things and concepts that we've been talking about so far, these next few weeks are going to be in this Biology 2E textbook, which can be found, again, in the same OpenStax. You click on Sciences, and so it's the Biology 2E rather than the Concepts of Biology. So we're going to start out in this textbook in Chapter 30. So we're going to jump around a little bit, but again, we've covered a fair bit of ground already with some basic understanding of biology and science and things like that. But now we can start getting into more specifics and looking at the plant specifics. And so I think this text and in these chapters is a good place to start. So for this week, we're going to look at Chapter 30 and Section 1, 2, and 3 in Chapter 30. So again, Chapter 30 in Biology 2E in the OpenStax textbooks. Alright, so we're going to start out looking at plant organ systems. So we're really just looking at these plants as organisms, and it's oftentimes, I think, easy to sort of forget that plants are living creatures very much the same as you and I are. They're just very different than us, but they do have organs, so they do have these specific accumulations of tissues that perform these specific functions in their bodies. So we start out looking at plant organ systems, and we can look at reproductive organs. We can have what are called vegetative organs, and both of these types of organ systems are going to be split into what are called the shoot system and the root system. The shoot system is the above ground growth, and the root system, not surprisingly, is the below ground growth. To build these different organ systems, we need to use different types of tissues. And there's a number of different tissues within plants. We can have meristematic tissue. So these meristems are places on plants that are growing. Not all plants grow continuously throughout their lives. And some plants may grow very much in some parts of their bodies, and some may stay stable in their size in some parts. So really there's a lot of variety in how plants will grow, but regardless, all growth is going to be in these areas called meristems. There are apical meristems at the ends of shoots and roots. We can have lateral meristems where things grow out to the side. There's some variety there, but as you're going through and reading through this chapter, understand that this meristematic tissue is where plant growth is taking place. We can have vascular tissue, which is actually similar, at least in function, to what you would think of as vascular tissue in yourself. So for humans, vascular tissue are your veins and arteries. In plants, vascular tissue makes up the tubes that water moves through. Plants pick up water from the ground and move it through their body systems, and they do that via this vascular tissue. We can also have dermal tissue, which is basically the outer layer, or the skin, if you want to think about it that way, of the plant, and ground tissue, which ground tissue generally takes up sort of the bulk of the plant, and that's where a lot of photosynthesis and things like that occurs. 30.2 in this text is all about stems, and stems are very, very diverse parts of plants. They can range from very, very small, depending on very small plants, or even hundreds of meters if you look at some of these underground rhizomes and these sorts of structures. So stems rather are a very diverse piece of plant anatomy, and what they really are for the most part, is support. They're there to hold the plant up. Sometimes they're there to sort of move the plant sideways through the soil, but support is really a very important function when we're talking about stems. Stems have some fairly specific anatomy, and this anatomy is made up of different cell types. three main cell types that we're going to talk about are called parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma cells. The parenchyma cells are the most common of the plant cells. They do a lot of metabolic things for the plant. So if photosynthesis is occurring, it's probably in parenchyma cells. Sometimes they can store starch, they have immune functions, so they're very common sorts of cells within plants. Collenchyma cells provide a lot of structural support for cells, especially in the stems and the leaves. When they are mature, they are alive, so that separates them from the sclerenchyma cells, which also provide support in stems and leaves, but sclerenchyma cells provide this support usually when they're dead. Again, dermal tissue is sort of the skin or the outer layer of plants, and if you're looking at woody plants, you'd call it bark, but it's made up of a couple of different types of cells. We're looking at the dermal tissue of leaves. We can have what are called guard cells, which open and close to allow gas exchange with the environment. So plants respire through some of these dermal tissues as well. Trichomes are hair-like structures on these epidermal surfaces that prevent water loss and things like that. So again, dermal tissue can be very diverse. As you're going through the reading, if you have any questions, please feel free to engage in the discussion board with your questions, or simply email me if there's something specific that you'd like me to maybe cover in more depth or something like that. We also have vascular tissue, and vascular tissue is made up of two main types. We have what are called xylem and phloem, and they provide different functions within the vascular system of the plant. And depending on whether we're talking about monocots or dicots, the xylem and the phloem arrangement is going to be structurally somewhat different between those two differentiations. Usually when we're talking about xylem and phloem, you can think about xylem as moving water up from the ground up to the tops of the plant, and phloem moving water and, more importantly, the sugars produced in the leaves and other photosynthetic structures back down to the roots. So when we're talking about xylem and phloem, we're really talking about these sort of movement structures within the plants so that they can move water up and down throughout their entire anatomy. The ground tissue in stems is really made up of these parenchyma cells and really sort of provides a lot of the actual structure of the stem itself. When we're looking at growth in stems, we can have growth in a couple of different ways, right? These stems can get taller, so we can have this sort of vertical growth, or these stems can also get thicker, and so we have this lateral growth as well. So primary growth is this lengthening of the shoots and the roots, and secondary growth is this thickening of the plant as well. So we can describe the growth in different ways, but it generally occurs along these very sorts of specific areas within the plant. You can see that in figure 30.10 of the plant, where you can see these different structures within the cross section of the stem, and you can see how these things grow in these very specific places. You can see the sort of growth in a tree not just by how tall it is, but also by looking at what are called annual rings of a tree. So if you're familiar with a cross section of a tree trunk that's been cut, it has these growth rings encircled around the circumference as this tree was growing outwards, and you can look at that, and because plants grow at different rates throughout the year, it sets up this very predictable sort of pattern of slower growth in the winter and faster growth in the summer, and you get this alternating ring pattern along the stem of the tree, and so you can see this growth pattern as you go. Stems are also often very modified, and we see this modification for storage, so starch storage, so energy storage in plants. We see corms and tubers, bulbs. These structures are important because they allow plants to store excess energy that they produce while the sun is shining or during growing season, and store it so that they can survive through the winter or through a dry season or whatever environmental sort of factors prevent their growth. We can also have some stem modifications through rhizomes. and stolons and runners, and these are underground stems basically, that or above ground stems that move along the surface and allow plants to move from one place to another. We don't usually think about plants as moving, but plants can be fairly mobile. Although one stem usually stays in one spot, it may send out part of its anatomy and move across the ground. If your yard has creeping Charlie in it, for example, a pretty common weed, that stuff spreads very rapidly via these underground or above ground stem structures. When we're talking about stems, we're really talking about the shoot system, so the structures that are usually above ground. If we move below ground, then we're talking about the root system. So the roots are equally, if not more important than the stem system. Roots usually grow underground. There are some orchids, for example, that have what are called aerial roots, so they grow into the air. Usually those organisms live in, say, tropical rainforests where there's a high amount of moisture in the air, and so they're able to absorb enough moisture through their aerial roots. But for the most part, root systems in plants are underground, and they usually have one of two types of forms to them. We call some of them tap roots, and that's where you see this large, sort of angular shaped root that bores deep into the ground. Perfect example of a taproot is a carrot. If you think about a carrot, there's your taproot example. You can also have what are called fibrous root systems, where the root systems grow out in this fibrous way throughout the soil instead of in this direct sort of straight shot through that you see with the taproots. If you think about the roots of a grass, so if we're in Iowa, or I'm in Iowa anyways, if you think about the roots of corn, real fibrous, real stringy, there's not a real discrete single structure that you say that's the main root of this plant. So fibrous roots tend to be spread throughout the soil, whereas a taproot is really this big straight shot down. Now, even with a taproot, there are definitely side roots and rootlets that come off of it, but with a taproot, there's clearly a main sort of root down into the ground. Oftentimes, plant growth starts with the root, so as the embryo starts to emerge from a germinating seed, one of the first structures that emerges is the tip of the root, so that the plant gets a good start moving into the soil. We can look at the different types of root growth and anatomy in this chapter, or in this section of the chapter rather, and we can see that root anatomy also has some fairly specific structures as well. But again, as you're looking through, say, figure 30.17, you can really see this cross-section of this root has a very specific and well-defined areas of cell anatomy, or root anatomy rather. You can see that with these cells. Not surprisingly, we can also see differences in root structure between the monocots and the dicots. The monocot roots have sort of very ring-shaped, very classical sort of ring-shaped structures within the roots when you're looking at the xylem and the phloem, whereas the dicots have this sort of very X-shaped. But it's really just a difference in sort of the growth patterns of these different types of plants. Very much like stems, roots can also be modified. Modification for roots serves a number of different purposes. Sort of when we think about how humans use roots, food storage is kind of what we think of. Again, storage systems, so rutabagas, carrots, these are big storage units in plants that really are there for the plant to store these starches, and we as humans simply just pull them out of the ground and eat them. There's also a lot of diversity in root growth depending on what sorts of environments plants live in. If you're a mangrove, so a tree, shrubby sort of thing that lives in the coastal tropics, you need a very spread out sort of branching root structure that is able to find lots of different places to hold on to in case a hurricane comes ashore and tries to push you off your sandy beach. If you live in a very wet environment, say like a cypress tree in the swamps of Louisiana, you may need additional structures on your roots to allow for oxygenation of your plant structures. So there's lots of diversity when we're looking at stems and roots and plants. And so as you're reading through, make sure you understand how these structures are built and how they differ between these different groups of plants.